Okay. Brother Owen?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a privilege and really a great honor to be here with Professor Schindler. To add a slightly personal note, I was speaking to Professor Schindler a little earlier, and my first acquaintance with him was through my late teacher at Catholic University, a kind of legend in the circles of Catholic University School of Philosophy, Dr. Thomas Prüfer. Dr. Prüfer died in 1973, but I can remember him put a buttonhole in me one day and saying, do you know anything of David Schindler? And I said, no, I don't. And he said, well, he's someone you should know. And so in many ways, I followed David Schindler's career and learned, I believe, many great things from him. But it was all due to Dr. Prüfer at Catholic University, who had the highest regard for Professor David Schindler. Tonight, our conversation, there have been 7 prepared questions that I'm going to put to Professor Schindler, and we'll go for about 40 minutes, and then Professor Schindler will respond in sequence to the questions, and then we'll open it up to any of the discussion that you might have. And the topic, this face-to-face with Professor Schindler, is philosophy dead? And there are many, including the noted physicist Stephen Hawking, who is convinced that philosophy is dead. I would like to respond to that by quoting from Professor Schindler's book, Heart of the World and Center of the Church, a book I've read on a number of occasions and have always learned many important things. This is what David Schindler says about philosophy. Philosophy becomes an authentic interpreter of Scripture only insofar as it has been inserted, as it has itself been inserted within and thus purified by this tradition of worship, creed, and authoritative teaching. In a word, it is not the case that philosophy plays no essential role in the authentic interpretation of Scripture. It is rather that it plays this role only by itself being anteriorly open to Scripture's own self-interpretation, the interpretation guided by the Holy Spirit in and through the Church. So, from that position, is philosophy dead? The first question. Professor Schindler, last year the physicist Stephen Hawking declared that philosophy is dead, which of course sounds like a philosophical statement. Anyway, is it true that philosophy is not feeling well? And how is theology doing? What is it like to work as a philosopher and a theologian in a culture dominated by scientistic ideology? So, a pretty tall order at the beginning. Is philosophy dead, Professor Schindler?
So, first of all, thank you for your introduction, and thanks to Crossroads for the invitation. And I look forward to a sort of freewheeling discussion here with Brother Owen and eventually the people who have come. And I hope people will feel free to ask even difficult questions. Regarding Hawking, I mean, an initial response has already indicated. I mean, it sounds like a philosophical statement. When I got this list of questions, what came to mind immediately, I presume everyone can hear in the back without the microphone. Good. I was reminded of a statement of, one of my favorite philosophers, one that really shaped my work in a really decisive way, Etienne Gilson, in his book, The Unity of Philosophical Experience. And, one of his main conclusions in the final chapter is this statement that I've come back to because it's so usable in the contemporary situation, which is that philosophy, by which he meant primarily metaphysics, buries its undertakers. So, I mean, the first thing, sort of obvious thing to say is that the difficulty in regarding any claim of the death of philosophy is that it always implies a philosophical judgment, something about the nature of reality and what it means to know reality. And so you can't escape it. And we could talk about that, but I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about that implication. I mean, there would be all sorts of implied metaphysical judgments in that judgment that metaphysics is no longer possible. The key thing I wanted to focus on, and and feel free to jump in at any point, and there are some of these might anticipate later questions, but the first thing I would, two or three things I would say at the outset. First, regarding philosophy, it seems to me whatever else you say, the question is what do you mean by philosophy? And philosophy, whatever else you say about it, it seems to me the heart of it is wonder, a sense of wonder at reality, and in the context of that wonder, a desire to understand things for their own sake, as they really are. Secondly, to understand things intrinsically. And then thirdly, in that context also, to understand them in the context of an openness to transcendence, an openness to God. So that philosophy in the root sense is what I take to be embodied in a figure like Socrates, in the Greeks, and in classical Christianity. And so the question is, and so in a certain sense, if you put it in that context, I think it is not entirely wrong, although I would say it for opposite reasons, and with an opposite sense in mind or concern in mind regarding the death of philosophy, that I think we do live in a very unphilosophical age. And why? It seems to me because if those are the features of philosophy, then the question is, what is it that sustains that kind of activity? That really is the crucial question. So to have philosophy in a true sense and in a profound, significant sense would mean really a life of wonder, a concern to understand things not just instrumentally, but for their own sakes, and an openness to transcendence. So that's the question then. In a philosophical age, there would be the presence of those elements, sort of in the heart of the culture, such that people would be inclined to operate that way. And I think in that context, so in what sense do we not have a culture that sustains that? And I would say the heart of the matter, you could put it in different ways. I mean, these are enormous questions. But it seems to me the heart of the matter in our culture is the absence of a sense of the given as gift. That not as sort of a kind of piety, but as the basic structure, the logic of reality, that the given, in the root sense, whatever given, is somehow has buried in it a giftedness. That is, it's not something that I first make or construct, it's something that I receive. And Ratzinger, in one of his early and most important books, Introduction to Christianity, distinguishes, the pre-modern from the modern period, that something in the pre-modern period, something is true and good qua being. In its very being, it bears a truth and a goodness, which means it's worthwhile. It's not only a brute fact, but it's something that's worthy of being paid attention to. Whereas in the modern period, the shift is to being, as Ratzinger says, quia factum or faciendum, which is to say something is true or good insofar as man intervenes, constructs. And I think this, to me, is really the root problem then of, I think, of our culture, which is that precipitous sort of constructive disposition toward reality. Instead of first receiving something and entering into it, The move is to instrumentalize it, dominate it, control it, use it for something. Doesn't mean it doesn't have a use and so forth. It's the first thing is to pay attention. And as a philosopher, Robert Spemann says that the fundamental core of freedom consists in first letting be the given. Letting be the given. So, so what I would say in our culture then, I think the human act that we have, it's a scientistic culture, I would say, is a positivistic culture. That is, that being is in the first instance something we posit, we make, and that takes expression in freedom and a voluntaristic conception of freedom. That freedom isn't an order of relationship so much as simply an act of choice, sort of a formal act of choice. Reason is instrumentalized, and religion becomes positivistic. In other words, relation to God is not something that's first given, that I discover, it's something I first construct, something I make. So I would say and there could go on and on about that, but in that sense, I think philosophy is in bad shape, and I would say, so to sort of summarize, you can see these questions. I don't know that we'll get through all the whole list here. Each one of them could go on and on, but if I could just conclude with this first question, I would say that I love the expression. It's sort of very similar to Ratzinger, but George Grant, a Canadian philosopher, died in the 80s, and I highly recommend him if you're not familiar with him. I think he's one of the great cultural critics of the 20th century, and his work is not very well known. But he has this beautiful expression, simple expression. He converted to Christianity when he was on a Rhodes scholarship in England. And he said it was very dramatic. It was, he was riding his bicycle. He'd been wrestling with this question. He came from a sort of liberal, loosely Christian bourgeois family. And he climbed over the fence and took his bicycle and climbed over the fence. He said he's on the other side, and he believed in God, and he knew he was a Christian. And he said it never left him. And he said later on, reflecting about that, what was the heart of that experience? And he said the heart of that experience is very simple. It was the recognition that we are not our own. And that is, 50 years later, that he's summarizing that. We are not our own, which is that our existence is a filial existence. We're creatures. We're creative, but we're creative in the mode of creatures. We're not creative in the way that God is creative. We're created in the way of we're sons and daughters in the Son. And so I think, so behind that then is creation. And I think so the summary point then would be, I don't think philosophy can live without recovering some elements of that, a sense that we are not our own, and recovering a kind of childlikeness. That is, that I'm going to add one more thing to that. I love this reading recently, Benedict. It was a retreat that he gave to the Curia, and with John Paul II present. And he's got, as he can do so, with his laser sharpness, and this wonderful expression. He's quoting an Orthodox theologian, and he says, the Athens, the Greeks were criticized by the non-Greeks. One of the criticisms were that they were aepaides. They were eternal children. And Plato said, well, that's great. That's not really a criticism. And Ratzinger points that out, and it's a beautiful. It makes the point beautifully. In other words, the childlike and the philosophical. There's a sense in which Socrates in the classical world is the child par excellence, right? Yeah. And so that's sort of the point. But childlikeness in the sense, in the context ultimately of creation. So it's a big task. I mean, And we're going to come back more. So in other words, philosophy is not in the first instance a profession, but I'll save that for another question here.
Okay, a lot to think about, but let's get to the second question. How did you discover your profession? Why is it important for you at a human level? Is there something contradictory in looking at philosophy, theology as a profession in the contemporary sense of the word? Would you encourage a young person today to try and become a professional philosopher? So,
No, these are wonderful things. I mean, you know, without saying too much about, you know, the history, I would say this: in going into philosophy, I've been in the seminary, Jesuit seminary, back in the early 60s. You know, the Jesuits were still Catholic. No, you know, I'm kidding. Okay, I hope there's some Jesuits here. But I mean, you know, I have many friends who are Jesuits, very close friends. But no, but the point was then I left the seminary. I went and studied, but it was what was clear to me. I have to say, I never thought about it as a profession. What I thought about is, you know, having gone to the seminary right after high school, which today they don't let you enter that. I was 17 when I entered the seminary, and then today I don't think until you're a college graduate, I don't think the Jesuits accept you. But the point is, these questions opened up, and that was the point, was following these questions. And it was as simple as that. The question then was, well, how do I do this and make a living? I mean, you know, in other words, what do you, and so I looked into all kinds of fields. Where could I carry this on? And I found this program out at Claremont that was kind of a mixed bag of theology and philosophy of religion, which I thought, this is perfect. I don't have to define myself really as a philosopher or a theologian, and went there and met there a man that is a great human being. His name is John Cobb, Methodist minister, I think one of the best Protestant theologians of that time. And what was wonderful about him is he was completely engaged. I mean, everything that he was profound, and I mean, he was a scholar in the best sense, and very well known. I mean, I don't think he's read so much any longer, but the point was, he was so engaged that all of this was of one thing. I mean, that he was thinking through these questions, and you know, at one point, he and his wife, they were raising, I think their children had moved out, but they moved together, got a group of professors, and wanted a more community living the gospel in a certain way. It was really quite striking. He and I had a lot of differences, even metaphysically. He followed Whitehead, and we had many arguments. It's where I really came to actually appreciate substance, was that in that environment where the emphasis was on relation. But I learned so much from him about modernity, and politically, he and I were very different. But anyway, it was that, and I would say, so the final thing I would say is, you know, encouraging somebody in a profession. I have to say this because this struck me so much when years ago when I first read it, Rilke, The Letters to a Young Poet, and probably many of you have read that. The line that I remember in there so much is the guy asks Rilke, he said, he's asking about himself being a writer. And Rilke's response is, you should be a writer, you should only be a writer if you can't live without writing. And to me, I think that's the answer. I think that for me, it's not a question of a profession, it's a question if you're going to do philosophy in the right sense, you don't approach it as a profession. I mean, you have to think about practical things and so on. But the heart of the matter is this, is this in your being, this mode of being, and is it so deep that I simply can't imagine myself doing anything else? And I think that's the question, in a certain way, I think that's a question we all have to ask ourselves in terms of what we do in life. It's the thing that I can't live without. I mean, at a deep level, and if it's that kind of question, it will be deep. And I think that is, and I could say a lot more about that, the states of life and so on, but what is it that you can't live without? And that's where you ought to look about what you ought to do with your life. All those the other questions, they're not unimportant, but they're tied to that, it seems to me.
Okay, third question. Can philosophical thinking be self-taught? Or is the relationship with a tradition and a teacher or teachers intrinsic to it? Whom do you regard as your teachers? Is it a paradox that the century, which has been so much dominated both by irrationalists and by positivists' ideas, was actually a very good century for Catholic theology? So, Professor Schindler, who were your teachers? You mentioned one already.
I mentioned Gilson, and I say something about that, and then go back to this question: Can you be self-taught teaching? Because I think yes and no. Obviously, it's yes and no in some sense, but you can't be self-taught. You can't operate outside a tradition and context of relationships and so forth. That's not ontologically possible, it seems to me. But first thing, in terms of my teachers, Etienne Gilson, I'm a priest in the seminary directed me to Gilson, and it just changed my life, reading Being and Some Philosophers and the Unity of Philosophical Experience. It may seem odd that, this essence and existence distinction is kind of boring, but it just became clear to me everything turns on this. And it was just incredible, and Unity of Philosophical Experience and other things. Christopher Dawson was, these are not live teachers, but they're the people that really decisively, it's hard to imagine my life without these people. Christopher Dawson, and the simple thing that religion is at the heart of a culture. Every culture, what defines a culture most fundamentally is, what does it make of God and religion? That's the question. And he's, he always was a little bit outside the academy, but I think that's a good sign. and he is, I think even today in his reading of Western culture and world culture. And another was Newman. Was for me a great influence, and what I learned from Newman is a very simple thing: is what he was willing to do for the sake of following the truth, and what it cost him. You think of what it cost him in his life. In his position at Oxford and so forth, and I think. I think his book, Essay on Development and the Grammar of Assent, those three authors in I would say in the first 10 years or so really of studying, and then there are a lot of other persons, and I had a teacher who actually introduced me to Gilson. And he just offered these meditations, and I'll end with that. Then I want to make another comment about teachers, but he taught metaphysics, and they were meditations, and he would come in, and there were 14 weeks in the course, and he did 14 meditations on the existence of God, the nature of evil, the distinction between essence and existence, the nature of the good, the nature of what's true. And it was sort of, I probably a lot of us have had teachers like that, but you would come in and you just feel as though your whole being is being reconfigured.
Sure.
And this is somebody who didn't refuse, you can't do that, be disobedient, but he was absolutely profound and brilliant, but he wanted to direct retreats, and that's what he spent his life doing. Never went on for a doctorate in philosophy, but I thank God he taught the course for maybe 2 years, and absolutely changed my life. And but it was amazing. He just would a weekly meditation on these problems, and you think these are abstract, but we'd read a few paragraphs from Aquinas, but then he would meditate, and then we would have another time a discussion. But in terms of just a couple of comments about being self-taught, I mean, first of all, it seems to me Plato is so wonderful in so many of these things, and he's obviously a huge influence on Benedict. But Plato, this idea that knowing is recollection, and that seems so odd, to know something involves some recalling of something that you somehow already knew. And Benedict develops that, anamnesis, memory, and he develops that in terms of the memory of God. And it seems to me that's a good thing to think about, and you think about being self-taught, because you discover it's part of being a creature, it's fundamental to being a creature, that when you think, that it's a recollecting of a relationship, in a sense that everything you do then is a response. It's not that I'm inventing this, even though I am original, but at the same time I'm taking up something that's present in me by virtue of creation. And I think that's a fundamental point. And then I think, in this country, this idea, Tocqueville is great on this. In America, and McIntyre is great in talking about this, that America, we think, well, this is really great because we're the unique culture, is that we figure things out without tradition. And what Tocqueville puts out is all that means is that unconsciously, the tradition you're following is Cartesian. So, and he says, so what does Tocqueville say? He said that never in America, he discovered in America that more people practice the precepts of Descartes than any place he's ever been, and at the same time, fewer people study him than any place else. And he said the reason is, it's the same reason, because they don't have to study him because the whole point is figured out for yourself. So they're standing in this tradition. Well, McIntyre, has great fun with this and talking about whether liberalism follows any tradition, right? And it's a paradoxical sort of tradition that's followed. Anyway, so I would say that. And then one final point that I want to make that's a little bit different on this, but I think the notion of beauty and following and the image of Hans Urs von Balthasar, I think this is so much the structure of learning, is that when the child begins to act in relation to the mother, the child finally smiles. That's such an interesting thing. And you say, you think, when the child finally smiles, who's the agent of the smile? Is it the mother or is it the child? Well, it's obviously, in some basic sense, it's the child. But it's the child as, it's the child as the smile, it's been, so to speak, elicited and born first by the love of the mother. In other words, it's a response that the smile of the mother penetrates the child. It's the epiphany of the mother's love, and penetrates the child, so that the child, when it begins to act, is responding. It's following something, and what it's following, to me, when you generalize that, what it's following is the attractiveness of another, and that's true of being as a whole, in a certain sense, the attractiveness of being, but especially the beauty of a person. And in a really fundamental sense, I think at root, that's always more basic than figuring things out. We're responding to something that's attractive, and it'd be a person. And so that the person is really operating in me. It's really responsive. And that's such an important point. And beauty, you know, again, we'll come back to the question, but beauty is not, it's not just aesthetics, you know, it's I would say the fundamental causal agent of reality is really beauty. Not as replacing truth or goodness, but as the summation of the unity, the integration of what's true and good. And as what's attractive, then it elicits your response. And so that, anyway, to go on, and I think, and that's what happens in a kind of teaching. What should happen in a teaching environment is the role should be something like that. That the student then is drawn forth by something that attracts. Not that it's voluntaristic. There's intelligence there, but it's the complete package of the intelligence in a complete integrated human form. Anyway, so
A lot for discussion. Question number 4. How do you understand personally the Pope's repeated calls for a broadening of reason? Why is a reduced use of reason one of the major problems we face, as opposed, say, to ethical failures? How can it be addressed in the world of education? So the role of reason, especially in its shrunken form today, Mr. Schindler.
yeah, I think you know that lecture, the famous lecture that he gave at Regensburg. I mean, it's been other places, you know, that he said these things. The gross misunderstanding of what he was about there, which was he was lecturing to the professoriate at the university, and he was speaking also about Islam, and everything got focused on as though this were primarily about Islam, but it was clear that he was doing two things simultaneously, both having to do with reason. And one was to say something to the professors, the Western professoriate, that reason is open to a logos of love, which is ultimately, you know, revealed in Jesus Christ. And so that you have a truncated view of reason if you don't open it up. And that's reason. So it has something to do with the structure of reality. It isn't just love and God or some sort of pious, acts of piety or something. Not that piety's anything wrong with piety, but it has to do with reality. Okay, it's ontological. And on the other side, in terms of Islam, to try to show that belief in God entails an openness to reason. So he was taking a position that was not a halfway house, but something other than both of those positions. And so much got lost in that. And I think this is, you know, his motto is that his coat of arms is, you know, cooperators in the truth. And this question of truth and reason is so fundamental for him, and God-centeredness is so fundamental to him. And he's talked about that in other contexts, like this thing that I find so fascinating. On the one hand, talking about a need for a new concept of secularity. When he went to France, and Sarkozy had recently said something, or maybe in his opening remarks had said something about the positive sense of secularity. And he is so acute, and he picks up on that, and he says, you're right, we need to rethink this concept of secularity. And then what does he do? He talks about the need for monasticism. And as the monastic heart of monasticism is necessary for any authentic human culture, not just historical, the contingent fact that it influenced Europe, but that any human culture to be authentic has to have that spirit. Now, he obviously doesn't mean everybody ought to become a monk, but what does he mean? The search for God and the readiness to listen to him. That without that, you can't have an authentic human culture. And I have to say, in this context, what I would say is, this work, the books that for me, I think are very important books, are books by, and helpful in this context, are books by Giussani, The Religious Sense and The Risk of Education. Both of these, I think, this to me has always been absolutely central contribution of Giussani. It seems to me it's of a piece with what Ratzinger is about in broadening the concept of reason. A concept of reason that takes account of all the factors in reality, is not reductive. And ultimately that means you can only take account of everything by ultimately put it in a context of relation to God. There's I think more to be said about that. Oh, the other, that I will say one more thing. I already mentioned it, but this, in terms of ethics, the ethical dimension, it's so, again, it's interesting, and he's, a thing he did on conscience, Benedict, and he says we have to recover. So we think of conscience, what? It's some sense of synderesis, do good and avoid evil. And he says, of course, but he said we need to recover this. There's another aspect, what he calls the ontological dimension, the dimension of conscience. And what is that? Memory of God, anamnesis. So that the moral awareness at a deeper level is an ontological awareness that's given with our being, that we have this sense of God. And there's a lot of resistance to this kind of thing, because then the objection is, well, but then how can that be true of non-believers? And he sees there's a lot at stake there. If that isn't true for non-believers, you lose the basis of missionary work. In other words, if there isn't some echo in every human being, and he says the known or the unknown known God, of whom St. Paul speaks, is precisely this. He's calling forth that there is no such thing as a human being who has a basic capacity of awareness, who isn't in some way aware of God, and he sees that as the dimension of conscience. So he puts that in there as more profound than awareness of good and evil. Good and evil is essentially bound up with that. Okay, but it's the ontological religious sense that is more profound. So.
Okay. Question 5. How does a broadened reason, quote unquote, play out in the public sphere? Please comment on this recent statement by the Pope to the German Parliament. Quote, how do we recognize what is right? In history, systems of law have always been based on religion. Decisions regarding what was to be lawful among men were taken with a reference to the divinity. Unlike other great religions, Christianity has never proposed a revealed law to the state and to society, that is to say, a juridical order derived from revelation. Instead, it has pointed to nature and reason as the true sources of law, and to the harmony of objective and subjective reason. So, how do you respond to that?
It's amazing. It's important to pay attention, among other things, when listening to Benedict, is he's teaching us a new form of dialogue. It's so important to see that. That is, he goes to the heart of the matter. Our conception of dialogue is okay, let's set aside all the things we really believe in. Let's look for some bare minimum, and let's start there and then sort of construct ourselves. And so then we'll find verbal agreements, and yet the people involved in the dialogue know that you haven't gotten to the tough parts. What is the point is that you can really make contact. What you need to do, and what Ratzinger does, is go to the heart of the matter. And what you have to do in your dialogue is start where the person believes most. What do they really believe in? And start with that. And what do you really believe in? And then work out of that to see, for example, you want to affirm freedom and respect. Well, you want to show how that grows out of what you believe most profoundly, not what you're most indifferent about. So what does he do? I mean, he talks about the green movement and ecology in this talk in the Bundestag, but he says, it's very bold, in a later passage there, he says, really, this is the purpose of what my address is, to ask for an opening of discussion and debate on these questions. And what is the question? So he says, Christianity doesn't base the law on revelation. This is true. You can't have a law and, explicitly say, okay, let's embody the Trinitarian theology in the First Amendment. But then what he goes on to say, but the point is, you can't that what you base the juridical order on is a reason which in fact is open to God. So he's back to his common theme, that we have to see that the only reason that can make the juridical order work is a reason that's open to God. Okay, so he's pressing that question again, where's God? Where's God and where's love in reason? And then what I would say further that's implied here is a renewed sense of the importance of ecumenical dialogue now as relevant to the political problem. In other words, as soon as you say you're open to God and you really pursue that debate, then what's the question you're going to have to answer? Well, who or what is God? And what sort of God can best account for reason, you see? And so you're forced, then you move into, of the inner logic of the discussion, then you have to face, okay, what is Islam? What do the great religions hold about God? And in what sense can they sustain reason rightly understood, and Christianity? But you see the movement, there's a new way of dialoguing where the question, the things that we value most, reason and freedom in our culture, he's opening up the discussion by pushing those things to their roots and trying to uncover the presuppositions and to get the culture in a debate, not just to remain silent about that, and say, well, we all believe in freedom. Because he sees if you don't go to this deeper level, then freedom in the end will unravel. It'll unfold into its opposite in many ways.
Question 6. Another long-standing division in the Western world is between knowledge, understood in abstract and scientific terms, and the experience of beauty. In your work, how do you integrate theological reflection and art?
Well, I don't know how much art is there, but every time I read something by my son, I think whatever was there, I think it skipped a generation. But I think he does a pretty good job. A lot of people remind me of that. So, but what I would say is the experience of beauty and knowledge. Again, I've said some things earlier. Is I don't think you can have an adequate conception of knowledge except in a basic sense. It's got to be tied to beauty and in a number of ways. And for me, the key is part of the task of an expanded notion of reason is to recover beauty as one of the transcendentals. That is, that beauty is insofar as something is, it's inherently true, good, and beautiful, and then to show what that is. And I think that beauty, I mean, you can talk about a certain priority of truth or goodness or beauty, but it seems to me beauty, in the end, is the most adequate way to talk about reality, that a reality that is a matter of love. And because it comprehends both what's true and what's good. I mean, it doesn't talk about the good in moralistic terms, and it doesn't talk about what's true in formalistic, technical terms, but it's an integration of the true, integration of the two, and I think that's what's seen. You know, you're all familiar with the statement of Dostoevsky, which I think is true. You know, it's beauty alone that will save the world, and I think that's quite literally true. I mean, because love will save the world, and I think beauty is the most proper language of love. And I think you could say also this is what Dante, you know, that lovely way that Benedict begins Deus Caritas Est, his encyclical. You know, that what is it that moves the stars and what makes the world go round is love. And I think another way of saying that is beauty is, and therefore beauty is not just aesthetics. The danger in seeing beauty as first aesthetics, it really is, it's a cause. I mean, it has something to do with what makes reality be real and accounts for action and so forth in reality. And it seems to me, I mean, in the end, I think, you know, Balthasar's work on this is if you lose the integration in beauty, your truth becomes formalistic, and the good becomes moralistic. And what holds those two together is an integration in beauty, and I think that's fundamentally true. So,
Come to the last question, and then we'll open it up. Professor Schindler, by a happy coincidence, a new book of yours just came out, Ordering Love. Can you tell us what it's about? Can you give us focus on what you're aiming at in this new work?
Yeah, I mean, that's probably a lot of this can come out in questions that people have to answer, you know, this or that. The subtitle is Liberal Societies in the Memory of God, and it was actually originally going to be 2 volumes, and they wanted to put it into 1 volume in the second volume, so it's 2 parts, 1 volume, and the second is focused on, you know, the technology is sort of the key problem of the culture, not technology as technological devices, but as a mindset, as a logic of being and consciousness, that is, and it has a lot to do with what I said earlier about seeing something as true and good only insofar as I manipulate it somehow. I mean, manipulation is fine in a certain context, but not at the expense of first taking the time to see it for what it is and respect it for what it is, as a thing of nature, as something given. And so what I would say is basically the heart of the matter is, I mean, it's that love is the basic meaning of reality. God-centered love is at the heart of reality, and it's what's most real. That relationship to God is what most determines the fundamental structure of being. I mean, both metaphysically and in revelation, and it's sort of, so it's a sense of the given as gift, and then looking at that. I mean, a question that's always preoccupied me is what these questions mean in terms of the logic of the culture and the structure of institutions, and I absolutely believe that love is the logic of reality, and it's a fundamental logic of being and acting, and it ought to be what forms our institutions, political, economic, academic. And by that I mean that we ought to do these things and then have sort of this act of kindness or goodness or something of that sort, but it's the inner core of reality, and sort of spelling that out. And one of the things is that, and this is developed here and there in the book, but I'll say it now, and then there are a lot of other things here, but I really think one of the things here is to take account this question of exceptionalism, American exceptionalism, that in America we have an exceptional form of liberalism, which is different from continental liberalism. I mean, many of you are familiar with that distinction, which is a real distinction. And what I think that it's important to see in our culture that there are two sides to that. I mean, there's something very unique about American culture and positive, but the very strengths have problems. And I think some of the strengths, Grant talks about this, there's a real innocence among Americans. And it's easy to sort of mock that. But Americans aren't cynical. They don't have that sort of a sophisticated cynicism. There's a kind of innocence in a kind of energy, and it has to do with the land. I mean, coming to a country that had to build a culture, and there weren't a lot of educational institutions, and you do it yourself, and all those kinds of things. And there's something very positive, and then the energy in that. And I think there's something very important, and Grant speaks of that. The other side is that I still think we haven't come to terms with the sense in which our culture is shaped from the inside through the legacy of a Puritan enlightened culture. And that is really worth looking. It's a very complicated question, but I think what I mean, I could put it in certain terms. There's the cultural implications of the lack of a sacramental church, the cultural implications of the lack of a Marian church, the cultural implications of the rejection of monasticism. These things, the problem is we think of these as sort of inner churchly implications, but not how they gave rise and they shaped an economy and a politics and an academy. And just to take the example of monasticism, what was going on there? I mean, this stuff gets very complex, and I don't want to go on too long to make sure there are some questions, but to make this point only, is the rejection of monasticism was tied to a reconfiguring of the relation of time and eternity. That's what was going on. And now think about it. I mean, so what happens is it wasn't that, there used to be monasteries, and now in that reject, because in Protestantism, the monastery was sort of premature eschatology. It was presumptuous to want to live this way. And so you eliminate that way of life in favor of marriage, and you take more seriously the world. And there's something very important about that. So the lay dimension and the ordinary life having importance. But what happens, it comes at the expense of an extrinsic relation to eternity. It's extraordinary. So all these things that Benedict is talking about, there's no sense of deep sense that we're open to God, and and therefore to eternity, and that eternity is necessary to make sense of time properly, the temporal order. So it affects what you mean by intelligence, what you mean by freedom, and how you order the temporal aspects of an economy. Where is the openness to the eternal? And the problem is you have no. I probably should stop here because to go on, but it's to unfold what happens there. You have no sacramental church, which means you have no infallibly effective presence of God in history. That's extraordinary. And coincident with that, you eliminate, because of sin, you have the corruption of sin, so there's no integrity of nature as open to God naturally. Man is no longer homo religiosus, a rational, a religious being, because that's been fractured, and so forth. And then you have, because there's no infallible, effective sacrament, where that's felt most is penance. No confession. So, and then you, in the context of being sinners and the threat of damnation, and not being able to go to confession. I mean, just imagine, take confession out of your lives. You know, what Catholics, you know, there's a sense with Catholics, at least you go to confession and there's a sense, you know, at least for the few minutes there, I'm saved, right? I mean, something can happen, but there's a peace that comes from that because I don't have to produce it. It's ex opere operato isn't a burden, it's a liberation. And you take that, just imagine, you take that away. And so the question is, you're looking around for signs of being saved, and you can't produce those because that would be a false Pelagianism, but you look around and it can't be mystical experience because that's not accepted. Mystical experience implies too much of an open relation to God, so it's behavior. So you look for those signs, you rationalize, and so on and so forth. So there's this intense rationalization of life, and it's not accidental, as Robert Merton, a classical sociologist in the early 20th century, points out, that for all kinds of reasons then, modern science, and the Francis Bacon and Descartes, that method of science was very important in rationalizing life. So that the key, the bête noire of Calvinism, American Calvinism, was the useless and leisure. Right? Doing nothing is not being in contact with God. It's wasting time. Now, I realize there's a lot of controversy around that, but I mean, I have a few answers to the objections. So in any case, I'll end with that. I guess we can take some questions.